is Don Christiansen. I've professionally been an educator and a minister. I'm a retired pastor in the United Church of Christ, a native Iowan. Grew up in the state of Iowa, lived there much of my early life. Went to Iowa State University where I did a bachelor's degree in history. And then immediately followed, that was in 1965, I graduated, which of course you know was the beginning, early in the Vietnam War conflict. And so just about every young man my age, of my generation, had to make some kind of decision about how they were going to relate to that war. And the more privilege we had, in terms of the more choices we had. I was one of the more privileged, being white, being from a family, upper middle class family, having access to not only college but graduate programs, being straight. All of these things meant that I had more choices about how to participate or not participate in the war. And the first thing I did was chose to stay in school as long as I could, because that was a deferment from the war. Another deferment, there were many, many deferments, as you probably remember, Dick, back in the early 60s and late into the 70s. Young men could be deferred from military service for being in school or graduate school, for being married, for having a child, for being gay, for having certain physical disabilities, for being in studying theology or being a theological student. Those are some of the ones that come to mind. And so I took advantage of some of those, and I stayed in school, and then I went in to study theology, Theological Seminary in Chicago. Before I did that, another deferment was to be in a program such as Peace Corps, where you were doing some kind of voluntary service. I don't know if domestic service qualified, but international service did. And so I went into a program right out of college, into a program sponsored by the YMCA called World Service Workers. And I was assigned to a YMCA in Nazareth, Israel. And so I spent a year there, 1965 and 66. Had a powerful impact on my vocational direction in my life. Say more about that later. But then, from that, after that year, I came back. The war was still raging, building. So I had to look for the next possible deferment from military service. I didn't want to serve. I knew that. A lot of my fellow students went into the military as officers. They went into ROTC. We were all required to take ROTC training in state universities. And so you had to do it as a young man. I took Naval ROTC first, and then I went into Army ROTC. I had to. It was a requirement. And so it was an easy jump into being an officer if one wanted to after ROTC, but I didn't want to do that. So I became part of the peace movement at that time, although I wasn't in the radical fringe of the movement where a lot of men were becoming conscientious objectors, burning their draft cards, chaining themselves to the doors of induction centers and things like this. A lot of my people around me were doing some of those, or leaving the country, going to Canada, going to Europe, Sweden, different places. I chose to take what for me was the easier path, to stay in school. And so I went to the Theological Seminary. There were a lot of guys there who were there for the same reason. We weren't necessarily, I mean, I did feel a certain calling to vocation and ministry, but if I'm honest, I was also there because it was a safe haven from military service, from the draft. And a lot of other men were there for those similar reasons. So my vocation, I have very mixed feelings about those historical factors and decisions that I made, because I had choices that a lot of young men didn't, especially men of color, poor guys. They didn't have all those choices. They were the ones who got drafted. They were the ones who suffered the most in that war. And so I think I've always had to deal. A part of my journey has been, okay, I had a lot of privileges that many young men did not have. What does that require of me? Does that require anything of me, or was I just lucky? And so I've always kind of struggled with what does privilege require of us? That's a very long intro.
So you started as a minister after having got out of your school?
Out of school, then I did this work in Israel for the YMCA for a year.
But then you get back, and then
I got back. I went to seminary. Yeah, I went to seminary, and in seminary, I really became involved in the peace movement. In Chicago, where I was living, those of us in seminary, there are lots of different seminaries, different churches. We were very involved in the peace movement, and there were many ministers who were leaders of the peace movement. Like I remember I went to seminary in 1967, the fall of 67. In the winter of 68, must have been early winter, Martin Luther King and another very well-known peace advocate minister, William Sloane Coffin Jr., and Rabbi Abraham Heschel, the three of them, put out a call to seminary students all over the country. And they said, we're going to have a march in Washington, D.C. against the war. And we want church leaders and seminary students to come. So our seminary basically, we had a big meeting. All the students and faculty said, what should we do? We said, well, we should go. So basically, classes were canceled for the next several days. Almost all of us, loaded into cars. Faculty members drove. We drove overnight to Washington to march with Dr. King and Rabbi Heschel and Reverend Coffin. So it was a very heady time in the peace movement for young people.
So you retired as a minister as well?
Yes, I retired. I'm still a very active volunteer in my church, but I'm no longer working.
And getting back to your introduction, you said you did not want to join army.
No.
So that was because of hatred for violence, or that you were just fearing war, you were not brave enough?
Oh, probably combination of many things, yeah. I mean, I did not, I didn't believe in the war. I mean, I was influenced. I first did. My family were quite politically fairly conservative. My mother was very active in the Republican Party in Iowa. But my younger brother was drafted into the Army. And when he went, she changed her view and she turned against the war. Primarily because she felt like the safest thing for my son is if he doesn't have to go to Vietnam, and if the war ends, and safest thing for all young men and women. So, yeah, I first didn't go, my first choices, earliest choices probably were made out of a sense of I want to avoid the violence, the death, the killing. But soon I began to develop an ethic of strong opposition on moral grounds to that war. And then later, as I got older and more mature, I became a pacifist. And I developed an opposition to all wars.
And then what did you do once you turned pacifist and you always disliked war?
Yeah.
And what did you do for the cause of peace in the rest of your life?
Well, I didn't become a minister right out of seminary. I did some other things for a while in the 1970s. I was very interested in another social movement at the time. I mean, the anti-war movement was a very large and dynamic social movement, but there were others at that time too, and I became very involved in one that was kind of generally called the human potential movement. And I became very interested in psychology, humanistic psychology particularly, and so I began developing a lot of. I developed a small business for a while with a friend of mine, and we did a lot of human relations consulting and training, and all of that sort of thing. But in about the end of the 1970s, as during the early Reagan years, and as the Cold War was really heating up and the arms race was going on, I wanted to get back into the peace movement and into work opportunities where I could be much more involved in the peace movement. It was a very frightening time when, I was a young parent, I was married, I had a young child, and it was a time of a lot of fears of nuclear war. They were growing. And so I was a campus minister by then, and much of my energy and work was going into the peace movement and trying to stop the nuclear weapons race.
So did you join any organization, or you were using your position of the minister to inspire people?
I did. At that time, and it was in 1982, I joined the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which you've probably come across in some of your interviews, and one of the oldest peace organizations internationally, and interfaith. I really appreciated that it was pacifist, international, and interfaith. And all those things appealed to me. And once I got active in that gave me a theoretical framework that guided my life and gave me a lot of direction from that. It gave me a whole theoretical basis on which to move and work.
So how active have you been with this organization you just named?
Well, I've been very active, less active in recent years, but I was on the National Council for a while, so I was a national leader. I was a staff person with that organization in Minnesota for a while, first as a part-time paid staff and then as a volunteer. So I've been very active through the years.
And you see many of these wars throughout the history and even now are fought in the name of religion. Some of the people try to give religious color to these wars.
Yeah.
I remember in the wake of 9/11 attack,
Yeah.
one of the speeches which was later on withdrawn,
Mm-hmm.
Bush referred to the Crusades, that he said the
Mm-hmm.
new crusade that began. So what role can church play in changing this mindset and inspiring people to be more peaceful?
Christian church or
Yes,
any
I'm
Christian?
Yes, being
Yeah. Well, I mean, what we can do is we can try to help people understand who Jesus was, what he stood for. I mean, I believe from reading scriptures and reading other people who've interpreted scriptures that Jesus was a pacifist, essentially. I mean, I think he was. You could say, you could build the case that he was a practitioner of active nonviolence in his time. So if people are at all interested in following Jesus, then I think it's an opening to teach them about active nonviolence.
So how can that be done? I mean, again,
it can be done from the pulpit. It can be done in education in the church at all levels. It can be done, I try to do it in everything I do at church.
But do you think church is such an important organization in American society, in any given society, in fact? So if church would have been playing its actual role, the American politics would have been less violent?
If the church had been
playing its due role.
Well, that's what Gandhi said. He said if the church was really what I understand it to be, I'd be one. I'd join it. I'd be a Christian if the church were followers of Jesus as he understood Jesus. So I mean, I think
you agree to
it could have played. Okay, it could play. Still could. And in any social movement. Like now we have, I think, a great opportunity for the church to give lots of leadership in the environmental movement, in the movement to curtail climate change. Because my goodness, what clearer identity does the church have than being, the sustainer of creation? It's pretty clear.
Yes. Okay, we know Vietnam War is over, but it keeps coming back in different forms and shapes.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
The mentality is there, the mindset is still there. We
Yeah.
still see America being the most violent country in recent history in the world,
Yeah.
attacking so many countries, sometimes without reason, without good reason.
Yeah.
So what do you think is the reason of, what factors push United States to follow those
We
policies?
see in the United States is the convergence of three very, very powerful dynamics, which are all wreaking great havoc in the world. And those are racism, militarism, and he didn't use this word, but I think he would have, and that is predatory capitalism. He talked about poverty, and he talked about consumerism. But I think he would have been very comfortable talking about predatory capitalism. So when you put those three together, those three very powerful systems integrated, they wreak incredible havoc in the world. And the United States is not the only perpetrator of all of those, but it is probably the fundamentally most powerful.
Okay, you've talked at length about your work with your inspiration and your work. What ways and methods have worked for you? I mean, you found them more effective. As I said, one of the reasons we're recording these things are
Yes.
just to set examples for others to follow.
Yeah.
So what ways and methods worked for you?
Well, the one that has been, the way that has been most effective, made the most sense to me has been active nonviolence, pacifism expressed in active nonviolence. And utilized not only in one's personal relationships and personal life, but especially through social movements. And I mean, I think Gandhi certainly demonstrated that, of course, very few people have had this vision and the discipline of Gandhi. But when that has been mobilized such as in the U.S. Civil Rights Movement and other movements, but particularly those, it's been powerfully effective, and I think it continues to be. Although the systems of violence have become increasingly sophisticated in developing ways to make the practice of active nonviolence much more challenging and difficult.
The other question I would like to ask you here is, most of the people which we came across here as part of our fellowship here, and then especially as part of our project, are very non-violent, very peace-loving, very caring, very courteous. But the collective impact is not there. I mean, and many individuals and organizations are working on the theme of peace. But we do not see any impact on the policies which US is following in the international arena. So where is the disconnect? What's going wrong?
I don't think there's a disconnect. I think we often fail to see, what's happening. I think the social movements have always been the place where change has happened, and that's the case today, and it will be the case in the future, because it takes social movements decades to achieve their goals, but they are continuing to do so. And I think we'll see that continue to happen. The environmental movement now, I think we're going to see well, look at what happened in Minnesota just last year with the movement for marriage equality. That happened very, very quickly, and it's sweeping the nation now. So these things can happen quickly, but usually they don't. Usually they take decades to achieve their goals. But I think that's happening. Always have. I mean, has for a long time, and will continue to do so. Although there are many setbacks, it's not an unbroken achievement. But there are many setbacks, many very disappointing setbacks, and there always have been and always will be. But I think, as Martin Luther King said, the arc of history bends toward justice, and I believe that that's true. If I didn't, I'm not sure I could continue to work in the movements.
So in other words, you're saying that you believe that in due course of time, US policies will become more human, more peaceful, more...
Well, I think they will, or the U.S. will become a minor player on the world stage. I don't think things are going to continue as they are. I mean, one of the areas I'm most involved in and have been for a long time is justice in Israel and Palestine. And even though that's gone on for many decades, the occupation and the injustice, I think that is going to change. We can begin to see now that the current situation is unsustainable. Probably only for a few more years is the current situation sustainable. And I think the United States, is going to have to, I believe, have a soft landing. It's an empire, but like all previous empires, it will dissipate, and we see that happening already.
At least that's the lesson of history, that no empire sustains.
Yeah.
Not in your case, but in many cases we see people of the United States very ignorant of what's being done in their name and with their tax money elsewhere in the world. So how are those people kept ignorant? Is there any deliberate attempt going on the part of any interest group, maybe by using media, by keeping people too busy in their own daily 9-to-5 routines, the capitalist society? Somehow people are not very well aware of things which are being done in their name and with their tax money. So why is
well,
that?
this is, of course, a deep frustration. I mean, I think there's so many things that contribute to that. Special interests that would maintain people in basically powerlessness, ignorance and powerlessness, and many of those have a great deal of power, And very bad decisions get made that maintain that, such as the Supreme Court decision last year. I forget what it's called, Citizens United, I believe. Was that it? Yeah. I mean, there are setbacks. There are things that you can clearly see where interest groups are able to bring their resources to bear to maintain ignorance and control, but I don't think those things are permanent. They'll all change eventually.
That's why we are here for.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have any question before I move on to my last questions?
No, I just
Okay.
proceed.
So, would you consider anything which has been your failure, your regret at this stage after having worked on this theme for such a long
Failures
time?
and regrets? Oh, many.
Would you like to share one big prime area that you consider a failure?
I think my greatest sense of failure have come when I have personally felt unable to make the theory of active nonviolence that I really believe is, I really believe in, when I have failed to make it work in an institution or in a personal relationship. Because I know it can. I believe it can. I believe, it's that it is that powerful and that is that true, but I'm not always able to do it. And because of my personal frailties, or the frailties of other people who need to cooperate also. And so I've had failings in some work failings and some personal relationship failings where I think if only I had been able to see more clearly, or had more courage or more wisdom, or whatever, but I don't.
So in the context of our discussion,
Yeah.
and considering the fact that this video would be used at peace forums and for the
Mhm.
purpose of spreading the message
Sure.
of peace, what message would you like to give to the audience, to especially the youth who would be seeing and watching this video
Yeah.
some later stage?
Yeah. Well, let's see. I'm thinking of a particular quote that is attributed to Einstein. And it's something like this. The biggest challenge facing humanity is to decide whether or not the universe is friendly. And I've concluded that ultimately the universe is a friendly place. It doesn't mean it's without evil. It doesn't mean it's without violence or fear. But ultimately, life is a good thing. Is friendly toward other forms of life. I think if young people would reflect on that, and if they came to conclude that yes, this universe is ultimately trustworthy, I think we'll make it. If we decide that it's not, that it is ultimately an untrustworthy place, then I'm not so sure.
So what should the youth do to complete the work which
Yeah.
people like you started?
Well, youth need our investment. They need our nurture and our care. I mean, I'm very concerned about the neglect of youth and the growing disparity of youth, those with privilege and the vast majority without. We've got to take care of young people and make sure that they have the kinds of opportunities that I've had for education, for travel, for volunteerism. And if we don't care for, so I'm a big one for investing in opportunities for youth and children to be all that they can be.
But then we see deliberate neglect on the part of youth as well. I mean,
Yeah.
they're more into mundane things, they're more into entertainment, they're more into things which are of their interest,
Yeah.
and they do not find time or any interest for politics or themes like peace, international cooperation, things like that.
Yeah.
So how to make them feel that they have to take care of these things as well?
Well, again, I mean, I think youth will choose those things. Not all youth, probably, all the time, but I mean, I haven't always made good choices growing up as a young person. I often chose things that were not the healthiest. But I think if we make those opportunities available, I trust that youth will make good choices for life, that they will choose life, and not choices that ultimately lead to death. And that's another part of the Christian message, and that is the command that we choose life. And I think young people will do that. I see them doing that. I'm getting very active in the environmental movement, and it's filled with young people. It is filled with young people. You're going to see that this Exxon pipeline gets stopped, or even if it's not stopped, you're going to see a lot of young people in the streets with us old people, because it's so symbolic of what has to change. And just as the first Gulf War in 2003, that was almost stopped. We came so close, the peace movement at that time, of not allowing Bush to bomb Iraq and lead us into that terrible quagmire. And it'll happen.
So, considering the fact that you've been minister for that long,
Mm-hmm.
would you like to give a message, peace message, based on the teachings of Jesus, Bible, or something like that? Do you want to think of any message which is based on religious teachings?
I don't think I have anything to add. I mean, I think I've sort of said it.
Already said. Yes.
I think if we study Jesus, his life, that we'll get the message. Yeah.
And even his crucifixion is one example of.
Well, yes. I mean, I believe that nonviolence is, it just is more effective than violence, but it's not without cost. I mean, it's not without risk. And most of the great practitioners of nonviolence have died early, young, because it's not without risk at all.
Thank you, Don. It's
Yeah.
a great interaction.
I'd also could I ask a question?
Yes, I offered you to ask.
Yeah. Well, I had to think about that. But you and I are more or less the same age. I'm 74.
Mm-hmm. I'll be 72 this summer.
And I'm a Vietnam era veteran.
Mm-hmm.
I was in the Army in 62 and 63, right out of college.
Yeah.
And I didn't protest. I went because you had a draft card, and I didn't have any big deal issues.
Yeah.
I have two brothers who are retired Air Force officers, so I sort of come from a military family.
Yeah.
And life was a struggle for me during the 60s, so I wasn't involved in the protest after I got out of the service. Anyway, with that introduction, I was fascinated by a comment that Reverend Verlin Smith made when he got the Hawkinson Award
Mm-hmm.
2 or 3 years ago before he died.
Yes.
And he was a campus minister in the 60s in California.
Mm-hmm.
And he was not an activist when he went out.
Mm-hmm.
And he observed that in his recollection back then, only about 2% of the student body were activists.
Mm-hmm.
I'll come back to that in a minute. The other observation from the 60s that was sort of striking to me is that there were two things going on at the same time in the 60s. One of them was all of the rights things.
Yes.
Civil rights,
Mm-hmm.
voting rights, women's rights.
rights.
And the other thing was Vietnam,
Mm-hmm.
which was another track. And I was talking to somebody once, and it sort of struck me that people sort of picked their path back then.
Yeah.
If they got engaged in the Vietnam issue, it was a big issue for them. And it wasn't so much of a big issue for the rights things generally. They sort of specialized in what issue they were in.
Mm-hmm.
And it just sort of struck me that this guy that I was talking with was sort of saying he only cared about the Vietnam thing. That was his deal.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he was judging Lyndon Johnson by his actions regarding Vietnam,
Yeah.
as opposed to his regarding civil rights.
Yes.
Comments about that? Because you lived in that
No.
same era.
Sure.
You were an activist. And
Well, I think Vietnam, you know, and all of the social movements were part of a whole piece. I don't think they were really separate tracks that much, although people couldn't really do everything. But I mean, I think this is my understanding of what Martin Luther King came to. You know, he said, people want me to just be a civil rights leader, but I see that the problem of civil rights is a result of poverty and racism and militarism, and so how can I be faithful to as a leader of this, you know, without dealing with these other things, the larger context.
Well, he had that huge speech in '67
Yeah.
in New York about that very topic. And maybe to get back to my initial premise, I think what I was sort of getting around to was that Hubert Humphrey, you know, the guy who's after which your program is named, had a huge amount to do with many good things,
Yeah.
but was judged forever by
Yeah.
Vietnam.
Yeah.
And Lyndon Johnson as much, if not more, and they were both in the highest levels of government at the time both of these things were taking place. It was just an interesting comment.
Yeah.
And then I asked this, you know, the night we had the World Law Day, I asked the kids about this 2% comment, and they were basically more, I think, on your line of reasoning that there's a lot of activism today amongst the youth.
Yeah.
That most of it we aren't really aware of.
I think that's true. Yeah, and I've come to sort of feel like I want to encourage activism on just about anything people are willing to be active on. You know, whether it's the food movement, you know, whether it's, you know, whatever it is. I mean, I think it's empowering. We need people to feel empowered, and if the movement contributes to that, then great.